So we're about to go live. We are fixing to go live. Hey, Ben.
Hey Thomas, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Pretty good, thanks.
Um, we are live on Facebook. Sorry, we don't have the fancy technology that like counts down the program or anything like that. So it's just us. We just come in and uh, we get it done. So dun dun dun. Welcome to this evening program. All right, so we are here. Let me share this out a little bit.
Oh,
All right, so basically, this is part two of our solidarity, solidarity series. Excuse me. Um, and so the last section we talked was about Black and Brown solidarity. Tonight we are talking Black versus White in a Gray World. And so I am anticipating hopefully a couple more Black participants. If not, then I guess I am it. If there are any voices online that want to participate, um, then let me know. Send us a message and I can send you the link to the meeting. But we are going to be discussing some commonalities and some of the issues that might exist that separate the Black and white community. Okay. And so we'll start with some introductions and then we'll jump right into the conversation. So, Julianne, why don't you start with an introduction?
Hi, I'm Julianne Vandergrift. I'm an attorney and a friend of Thomas's, and I'm happy to be here.
All right, Ben.
Okay, short intro, I guess. I'm Benjamin Wood. I am an organizer with the Pomona Economic Opportunity Center. That's my day job. So my work is mostly for migrant justice and the immigrant rights community. But we also work on issues of housing, and in my spare time, I've been working on police accountability, police abolition for many years. So, activist.
Awesome. JP.
Hi, yeah, I'm Dr. John Patrick. I am a faculty member at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. Thomas, I think I was your first debate partner, wasn't I? In college,
Yeah.
oh, allegedly. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I think these conversations are good.
Okay, so part of understanding really this issue is there's been a lot of movement, I'd say, on the white community as far as engagement on this particular issue. Um, so let's talk about maybe, are there any type of event or any type of circumstances that you think define what you consider your community to be that is triggering your engagement at this particular time?
I guess I want to. I guess I'm not totally clear on what you're asking. Are you asking like what is our motive for participating in this kind of level, or
Well,
like are you asking?
I'm trying to ask a compound question, so I understand why
Objection.
you're confused. Exactly. So the first part of the question, and hey, we have Aaron who is joining us. Um, Once he comes in, I'll go ahead and have him give an introduction. So the first question is, are there any key events that define your community, right? How you would define your community. But then I also want there to be like a twist in that to make it more, I guess, relevant to any newfound engagement on this particular issue. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. If I can paraphrase what you're asking, to me it sounds like you're asking what is it about my community that tags me into this issue, and is there some reason why I'm especially engaged now versus before? Is that?
If you want to interpret the question that way, yeah.
Yeah, I really have no idea how to define my community. I got to be honest.
Same.
White people have no community of which
Thank
I'm aware.
Right.
So, I know that some white people probably do, but I'm not really connected to my community except for my neighbor over here who's awesome. But like I don't really know my neighbors very well. The people that are part of my community are people that I work with, or they are people that I went to school with, for myself. And so, how do I define my community? Very poorly, I guess, is the answer to that. I really don't feel connected to my community here on the Central Coast. I think a lot of people on the Central Coast experience that entirely differently. There was a time when I felt more connected to the community, but my life has taken an inward turn especially since the pandemic, but since having a family. I see them most of all, and people that I work with most of all. As for why I'm engaged more now than I was before, I just didn't see a clear path to engagement that seemed meaningful or effective. Like all of a sudden, it seems like there's things to do, and this is of course my own fault because people were doing stuff, and I probably wasn't doing enough research to be fully aware of what I could be doing, and what opportunities were there. But I just wasn't aware. There were other things in my life that just were more salient to me, and things that I needed to take care of in terms of taking care of family members, in terms of raising a kid, in terms of developing my career. Those things just seemed more important to me getting settled into a life. And now that I'm settled into that life, I feel like I can do more publicly.
Okay, so really I'm hearing one, there was a lack of exposure and opportunity for how you could get engaged, but also that you have no connection to any direct community is what I'm hearing as well.
Yeah, ever since I left Southern California for the Central Coast, I've just not, and this is probably just a me problem. I've just not really developed a big sense of community here. And just as I was starting to develop that sense of community, uh, I ended up in some situations that kept me focused inward more than outward.
Okay. We see Aaron. Thank you for joining us. You want to give us a brief introduction?
You got to take yourself off mute.
Yeah, hello. I didn't know what type of introduction you're looking for. Was there specific items you wanted mentioned?
No, just who you are so people know who's talking.
Okay, so my name is Aaron Bratton. I don't know if everyone's from California, but I'm from Ontario, California. So if you know where that is, right next door to Pomona, between Pomona and San Bernardino. And just coincidentally happened to be wearing my Cal State San Bernardino shirt. So I'm a proud Cal State San Bernardino alumni. Also went to Pepperdine Law School. So I do a lot of community activism, and I've run some local political campaigns, and that's me.
Awesome, thank you. So we're talking about some key events that define the communities that we consider ourselves to be part of, and how those communities might be linked to the current movement that we're experiencing. Julianne or Ben?
I can go next, and I think it's interesting because you know, a lot of times people say like, oh, the Black community, the immigrant community, etc. But you don't really hear people saying, well, the white community. I think JP was kind of alluding to that. And I tend to think of community as like just wherever you find community, whatever groups you're part of, you know. So like when I think about events that mark my community, you know, I've been part of the immigrant community, you know, for a long time, and so I think of like 187 and people walking out of schools, and I think about the Great American Boycott in 2006, and I think about you know, HR 437 and or you know, the things that have kind of been high water marks in the immigrant community and the struggle you know, for immigrant rights. I'm also definitely consider myself part of the activist community. So like I think about like, you know, the Occupy movement breaking out and us camping out in tents all over the country and stuff like that. And that being an event that kind of helped define a particular subset of the activist community or particular group of the activist community. So those are the kind of things I think about in terms of events and community and how they overlap. You know, they help us kind of maybe define a certain moment. But as far as what's going on right now, I don't feel like, I mean, I'm thinking about, you know, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, some of the more recent killings that have gone on. And I don't feel like those have really galvanized me to participate more or less, maybe more because, you know, because there's an uprising going on, and you know, when that goes on, you just want to be in the streets, you know, with the people. But I don't think it's made me want to participate more. You know, I think police violence and racial violence is something that I've always been sensitive to and, you know, passionate about. I mean, I hear Cal State sweater, and I remember going out to protest for Mark Williams when he was killed by the university police department out there. So yes and no. I mean, I think we're in a particular moment where the current events are really drawing people out, but it's more, I think, just kind of defining something that's I think it is. I think you're right. It is pulling more white people out. I think there has been a growth in consciousness among white folks, and I feel like that's been spreading through social media mostly.
How about you, Julianne?
That question really threw me, which is why I texted you to ask for clarification. And I relate heavily to what John Patrick said as far as community, because I wasn't sure if you were asking me about the white community, and that isn't a thing. It's just not a thing. And so having come out of a conservative religion, when I left that community, I don't really feel, I mean, I have a legal community, I have people that I work with, and I have friends, and a lot of my social media are from people who I went to high school with. And but as far as like a community where historical events would like move us to do something together, I think that's not the case for me at all. When really most of the people my age were speaking out or saying things very different than what I'm saying due to recent, you know, with recent events. And it's kind of a feeling of loss of community as opposed to, hey, let's all get together and, you know, do something right in a situation where there's some real big issues that need to be addressed.
I think there's like,
ask me about my historically what events galvanized the people that I grew up around. It's the Constitution. Do you know what I mean? Like, we didn't all sit around and chit chat about current events the way that we should have. We worship sacred documents and the founding fathers. That's what we did.
Well, and so a commonality that, and thank you for sharing, but when you asked me for clarification, I didn't give you any, because the last event I had, I asked the same question, and I expected for people to define their racial community.
Uh-oh.
we lost them.
Yep.
Well,
Not for me.
what's that?
I lost them on my side.
Yeah,
did
we all
too.
did. Well, I think there's something, I wanted to ask you a question, both you and Benjamin. I find the idea of when someone said, you said either you or Benjamin said the phrase the white community, and I don't know, that just hit me a certain way, where it's like the only place that I would know that would identify anything that would be called the white community would be associated with race, like racists.
Right.
Like I immediately think like KKK members. I think Aryan Brotherhood. I think like those are people who are forming white community, and maybe there's a real problem with the fact that those are the people who are forming white community.
Mm,
Like, why are we ceding that to them?
that's an excellent question.
Like, that seems like just like a garbage policy on our part.
Well, there's like I think Upland is a white community, or some of these cities where they're
I
white.
wasn't aware that Upland was a community at all.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, and then I think too, it's where is community formed around that identity, and we don't have that burden, so to speak, of forming a community around an identity because white folks are like the default in this country.
Yeah.
So the ones that are hyper racially conscious about that whiteness tends to be those folks, unless you're completely on the other side and being anti-racist white folks, which that exists too, but much more marginally.
It seems like as demographic changes happen in this country, and the country is getting, browner every year, just because of demographic changes, the way that we welcome immigrants into the country, and the way that just birth rates are between different communities. There might come a time when the white community isn't the default. I mean, it's certainly not going to be in our lifetimes, but it would be awful if by the time that happens, if the only spaces for white community that exist are viciously racist. This seems awful.
Looks like Thomas is back. He's back.
Yeah, we got him.
All right. So
We
am I
kept it
back?
going.
Okay. Did they? I don't know if they killed the live stream or anything.
It still says live on Facebook.
Yeah.
Okay. Did you guys hear me yelling at my mom?
No.
Okay, good. All right. Well, internet problems. So I don't know where you guys were, but I wanted to just kind of shift and talk about transparency. One of the things that I heard talked about in one of our allied meetings is the privilege of being able to decide what you're exposing yourself to, right? So when I had people define their community the last time, their definitions of community had nothing really to do with race. And so having her make that statement, part of the privilege seems to be not being forced into defining yourself based on the event or characterization of any particular community. Is that something that do you feel compelled to identify with the community because of a forced identity?
Anything that looks like that isn't going to be race related for most white people, I don't think. There have been times in myself that I have identified with this group or that group based on socioeconomic status or based on faith or lack thereof. But and certainly you do feel, or I do sometimes feel especially white when I am embedded. So like, Thomas, when we went to Vegas with your brothers, like that was like a time when my whiteness was very apparent to me. I always think about it this way. It's like whenever you travel to a foreign country, you feel your Americanness more than you ever will when you're in America. Like I don't feel American when I'm in America. I don't really even feel Californian when I'm in California. But if you take me out of that, I feel those things. So if I'm hanging out and it's like you and your brothers, maybe Rob's there, maybe I think it was me. I think it was you and your brothers, Rob and Colin. And Colin and I were the only white dudes. Like in that situation, just behaviors are different and culture is different, even though there's overlap. And so your whiteness or my whiteness became salient to me in those moments, especially talking with your brother who sent me to do like white guy missions, which was I thought pretty incredible. Like he would be like, "Hey, go put our name in for a table because we'll get a table faster if you put our name in." And he would have me do like white guy missions, and in those moments it became clear. And he and I ran. It was your brother Nate. He and I ran like an experiment where he went to put our name in for a table and got quoted one time, and he was like, "Go put your name in and see what they quote you." And I got a shorter wait time, and it's just that kind of shit, you know. Like you it becomes salient when you're outside of it.
Dan, Julian, anything to add to that? Aaron?
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, if you have privilege, then you can basically choose whatever community you want to be a part of, usually. You know, like you could be a part of the punk rock community or the arts community or the downtown community, or like in my case, I can go and join the immigrant community and they'll be like, oh, mira este güero que habla español, you know, like, and they'll be like super happy to have me. Whereas, you know, not everybody would be that kind of welcome in other communities.
I see part of this conversation being about like community, but part of it being about social circles. So it's hard to like really say what community I'm in because, you know, sometimes I'm hanging out with young Democrats and it's a very diverse community. So I guess it's a community of young folks. And sometimes I'm at the Elks Lodge and that's like mostly senior citizens, white senior citizens. And I'm like the only black guy in the room and the only person under 50 in the room. But, you know, they're all my friends and I hang out with them. So, and then there's people I play basketball with. So part of this conversation is kind of like hard to define community in my head. I don't know what's meant by that. And then when you say like Upland's, when someone, you brought up Upland, and it's almost like community is in exchange for neighborhood. So like people who live in a neighborhood consider themselves a community. So I don't really, I feel like the terms of the discussion are too loosely defined and interchangeable for me to like nail down even
Well,
what
and
my
that's
community is.
that again is part of the point, right? Solidarity is found in our commonalities. But so when you're talking about your membership in the L district, there isn't that you're just young, right? It's also that you're the only black man, right? So like there's in that community, you're still forced into a definition that has you defining yourself separate from that community, right? So community itself is fluid and it's what binds us all. And that's why we're having this conversation, because as our communities overlap, that's how, in my mind, solidarity happens, right? Where race is no longer what defines us, but our interests and things, some of the commonalities that we start to find community and engagement in. So that being said, like for white folks, we have the Black Lives Matter movement, right? So that is something that is expressly a race-based, so to speak, movement, even though I see it as a broader struggle, right? What stereotypes do you have, or are you having to come up against Black Lives Matter movement that we're currently in?
That was real choppy for me. Could you repeat that?
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
What stereotypes
Mm.
have you had to face in regard to the Black community or the Black Lives Matter movement, that either that you've considered true, not true, whatever? What have you been taught, and what are folks saying? Could you guys hear me?
Yeah, I'm just thinking.
Okay.
I'll go. When this is something that John Patrick and I were talking about the other night a little bit. And learning to articulate and examine these the stereotypes, I think, is really important, but it's difficult to articulate because John Patrick, I think you said it was nonverbal.
Yeah.
And so I come from, a police background, grandfather, father, brother, no overt racism whatsoever. But I realized through the course of the conversation that I was prohibited from going to any areas. I was prohibited from going places geographically based on crime rates, honestly. And there was no explanation as to who lived where or anything. I just couldn't go. And so the conditioning that I experienced was very nonverbal. And I didn't even realize fully until we had the conversation last week to the extent at which my parents inadvertently taught me that there's more crime in Black neighborhoods and those are places that I should be afraid and avoid. And then reading that, like doing that at the same time and reading the new Jim Crow and seeing statistics on, drug use and actual crime and how it's, drug rates are the same in white middle-class neighborhoods as they are in poor areas. And I'm an attorney. I didn't even know that until I read that. And it's not that I wandered around talking about it or thinking about it, because we don't wander around talking about it or thinking about it. It wasn't until I was confronted with data and a conversation with someone else who was willing to talk to me honestly about their experience that I realized my personal conditioning. And I'm 51.
That's interesting to me because I don't feel like in this time at all that I'm being forced to confront any stereotypes that I have. I feel like I was forced to confront those much earlier than this. So there's not any stereotype that I think that I currently hold of Black people because I've just spent the last 20 years of my life getting to know Black people. And so, the conclusions that I have now about Black people are that you really can't draw conclusions about Black people.
So what were those stereotypes that you had to overcome? Like that was a learning process that some folks are just not being exposed to.
Yeah, I think so. I talked about this with you, Julian, the other day. Was when I got out of high school, I got into the workforce. Probably in high school, we had maybe 5 Black kids total in my high school, and so they were obviously navigating an extremely white space. So they were not really doing a lot of things that I've come to understand as being just part of Black culture. They were navigating white culture, and I'm sure they were putting on all kinds of performances for us that they wouldn't put on in another context. You know, if they were around their own families or around their friends from the Black community and stuff like that. I don't know. I can't speak for them, but this is just something that I suspect. Maybe that's a stereotype that I have, is that there are different ways that people act in different groups of people. Although I think that's just true of people. I'm not sure that that's a stereotype specifically. I wouldn't want to predict what specific behaviors these kids would enact around their families, but I would not be surprised to discover that their behavior at school was different than their behavior in other venues. So just no real exposure to Black people as a kid. My parents didn't have Black friends. They were very vocally about, like, don't be racist, especially having come from, on my dad's side, a poor Southern family that is, let me just tell you, and I, you know, if any of my family members on that side are watching this right now, sorry, but y'all are racist. It's just a fact that things that I've heard people say in my family are atrocious. So I probably picked up some of that stuff. But then when I finally got back into college, I went to culinary school, and I went to culinary school. I was living in Long Beach, and so I went to Cerritos College, which is in Norwalk. But so it's not quite as African American or Black as maybe Long Beach City College is, but it's still super Black, super Latino, and we had plenty of Latino students. So I was pretty much, you know, I understood Latino folks and the range of behaviors that go on in that community, I think, a lot better than I understood Black folks. When I got into culinary school, there was this pack of like 5 guys. It just scared the shit out of me. Like their ways were just different than my ways. They dressed in ways that I associated with maybe like gang behavior or gang attire, based on the types of bullshit that they told us in school about gang attire. And I remember this one guy in particular, he just terrified me. And then I was assigned in a work group with him, and I stayed in that work group with him for like weeks. And by the end of that first semester, I wasn't afraid of him anymore. Like I realized that, like, oh, he just dresses in a way that's different than the way that I dress. He just likes this fashion that might be associated with this kind of, I didn't have the language to describe it this way at that time in my life, but I just sort of realized, like, the way he's dressed doesn't indicate whether or not he has malice in his heart. It doesn't indicate whether or not he's a threat. It's just some clothes that he's wearing. And I mean, being in a Latino serving institution with a heavy Black population and being one of the only white kids in that environment, it's just life altering. Like I just had to confront everything about my fears about people of color, whether they were Latino or Black or even Asian. We had a pretty sizable, although I don't think I ever felt any sort of like unconscious. I think all of the biases that I was raised with when it comes to Asian people were like the model minority stuff. So like the Asians were the good minority. But yeah, it was a process of like really confronting, like, why am I feeling these irrational fears? And I honestly, Julianne, I don't think I understood why I felt them until we had that conversation the other day. Like I feel like that's the final answer.
Yeah.
That exposed everything to me in ways that I could never articulate before.
You can't keep referencing a conversation without at least giving us the nuggets of the conversation, right? So it seems like you guys went through a soul searching process, and that soul searching process is what the purpose of this conversation is, right? So because you've resolved it doesn't mean that we don't need to go through that resolution process with you. That makes sense? So
Yeah.
What happened? What are you talking about? What is the substance of that in a nutshell, that you're referring to?
Well, it was your words, Julianne. So do you want to just
No, you go
reiterate
ahead.
that? Okay. So like we're in this conversation in the Operation Ally meeting the other day, and the leader of our breakout discussion asks us like how we came to hold any sort of racist beliefs or racist attitudes. And Julianne just talks about how there was never any verbal condemnation of Black people, but that what she said earlier, how she was told to not go to these certain types of communities. You're just not allowed to go into that community. And I think you specifically said, like, and this is what did it for me, was like, you talked about how you were driving to an area and your parents locked the car door. And I remember that. Like, I remember that happening in just like the most visceral way. Like driving, I can remember the way the graffiti looked on the side of the building and I don't know, it must have been my dad driving. I don't know who was driving, but I remember them locking the door, and it's like, oh, why'd you lock the door? And they're like, oh, we're not going to a good neighborhood, we're going to a bad neighborhood. And that was in East LA, and then going through to sort of South LA over by Exposition Park, because we were going to the Natural History Museum, and we were on the freeway. Like, who the fuck is gonna harm you on the freeway? It's just fucking absurd. And I don't know, I hadn't thought about that in years. And then Julian, you said that, and it's just is like, I have this just such a clear image in my head of it. And they weren't trying to be shitty people, you know? They just were in that way.
So a couple of comments that were said kind of like triggered something for me. Julianne said something about the drug use rates, and just the cultural differences. So at Pepperdine Law School, one of my class, again, so in my class, there was 212 students in my graduating class, and I was one of 2 Black guys. So Pepperdine is known for being conservative, overly white school. And so, but in my class, I was the only, so then there's divided into sections. So in my section, so 70, 70, 70, pretty much in my section of 70 students, I was the only Black guy in the class. But I was friends with everybody. And one classmate in particular, we had like a little after party type of get together. And I was wearing a do-rag. And he said to me, oh, look at Aaron trying to be gangsta. And I had like immediate dread and fear, because in my head, I immediately thought, this guy's going to be a prosecutor, and he thinks Black guys that wear do-rags are gangbangers, not knowing that it's part of just how you do your hair. Like if your mom wears hair rollers, what does that say about her profession or what she does for a living? It's like a mechanism for Black men to have a certain hairstyle, but he immediately associated it with being a gangbanger. And so I immediately just got like dread and thinking, in 2 years, 5 years, he's going to be a prosecutor, and he's going, any black guy with a do-rag, he associates with criminology. So I told him what I said, and he said, there's a functional, it was weird the way he said it. It was very clinical. He said, I said, this is so I can have waves in my hair. And he goes, there's a functional purpose for that? And that just stuck with me, that he was boggled. And this is a, 2L, 3L law student, so he's a lawyer now. And it just made me think of like how much cultural ignorance is in. What also hurts me is that it's like people in high-powered professions, prosecutors and cops and teachers. I don't know if you guys saw the Palmdale teachers who took a smiling picture hanging a noose, and they thought that that was cute to hang a noose and take a group picture in front of a noose. And then 2 days ago, a young black guy was found hanging from a tree in Palmdale, same city. So yeah, it's kind of scary. It's kind of scary. What you said about the way the gentleman was dressing, what you associated with, I guess, gang attire.
Yeah.
And I just, in high school, I wore baggy clothes, and I've gained 100 pounds since high school, and I can finally fit those baggy clothes. Finally. But the cultural ignorance is kind of scary when you're not the person in power, but the decision makers, the person who I'm sitting across the table from getting interviewed by. I'm the interviewee, and I have to act a certain way to hope to get the job because I don't want them to think a certain thing. I remember one time we had a class discussion where it's an extreme example, but it was employment law class, and the discussion was about employers being able to check Facebook before they hire someone. And what prompted this conversation was that some idiot posted on Facebook, he was a Burger King employee, and he took a bath in the sink at Burger King and posted it on Facebook. And so the discussion was like, should employers have access to their employees' Facebook? And all I could think about, the class was like, hell yeah, if you're stupid enough to post yourself taking a bath in your Burger King sink, you deserve to get fired. But I couldn't help but think, okay, as a young black man, if I post a Jay-Z video to my Facebook page and my 50-year-old white guy boss hates Jay-Z, hates gangster, hates rap, or I post a Dave Chappelle skit that is hilarious to me, but my manager hates it because he drops the F-bomb, what type of consequences are there? Basically, I don't have the freedom to express myself even on social media out of fear of my my non-black, culturally ignorant supervisor not getting anything, any of the music, any of the movies I watch, and there being consequences. So a lot of what I'm hearing is just like a reflection of my experience in Pepperdine. People who have power in society who are culturally ignorant and make judges and decisions off of their observations of people.
Aaron, I think that's something that is a really important thing that I think a lot of white people can understand if you change the frame on that. Like, I think that what you said is so important, because if you change the frame on it, poor white people get talked about in these ways by rich white people. And so, like, if you don't have the right kind of Southern accent, you're the bad kind of white, regardless of how educated you are. Jeff Foxworthy used to do a joke about this that was like, you don't really want your brain surgeon to be like, what we're going to do is we're going to get a stick and root around right there in your brain for a little bit, but like, I think on white to white classism, because white people have ceased to see different races of white as races in this country, at least. Your accent means a lot. And I think if white people understood that the way their accents are perceived is directly related to the way that blackness or brownness is received, I think they could build some common ground there.
Why does it have to be reframed? What's the framing issue or what was the issue with the way that it was framed?
Oh, I don't think there's anything wrong with the way that it's framed. I think it's the ability to see the I in you, or to see me in you. I think it's that like direct empathy. Like if that's happening to you because of your skin, if I can see that happening to me because of my accent, I can recognize across the board that type of judgment is bad.
So I want to talk about actually want to talk about really I want to talk about white privilege, and this is kind of off the cuff. One, whose responsibility, what is white privilege? I want to hear you define it, because I think you guys all come from diverse backgrounds. What does white privilege mean to you, if it exists? And let's start there.
I think for me, and white privilege I would define that as the way that I move in the world without consequence to my race. So the fact that it's not something that I've had to think about until it started coming up in conversations with some of my online friends, and really I still don't fully grasp how it's benefited me. I'm coming to know how it's benefited me. You know, a really good example for me is just putting my son in any situation and then thinking about, like, do I, worry about him ever at 6'5", blonde, blue-eyed? And no, I don't, ever. Not when he goes jogging, not when he goes with his friends to the beach. I assume he will be met with open arms and everybody will treat him great. And then I think about my friends and their sons. And I think, how have I not been thinking about this the entire time I've been parenting? I guess there's a lot to unpack with that word and to the way at which I have benefited. But I think the biggest thing is that I've been able to be in denial about how my brothers and sisters have been having to engage with my country. I learned about things superficially, in history, and just moved about very focused on what affected me and my family, my kids, their education, and very conservative circles where everybody looked like me, and didn't have to reckon with the actual history of my country. And that me jumping in and out of the conversation is privilege.
Ben, you want to talk?
I can give you a couple of examples. Yeah, I think white privilege is me being a 16-year-old kid, driving a car, which I had a car, which is part of my my white privilege, with insurance and everything, to drop off some of the homies in another part of town, and the cops stopping us, pulling everybody out of the car, sitting them on the on the curb, and then telling me, you're free to go. And what am I going to do? I'm going to leave, but all the homies are sitting there on the curb, and, who knows what happens to them after that. People of color and poor white folks. Or white privilege is me being part of a multiracial group of organizers that put on a rally for George Floyd that ends up going to the mayor's house, where I get criticized for living on the wrong side of the Pomona-Montclair border, but the sister who is African-American gets called crazy and some of these other language that speak directly to the stereotype of an assertive African-American woman. So there's just a huge disparity in the way that the institutions and the culture, in general, treats young boy man, with white privilege, to people that don't have that.
I think, like, for me, it would be hard. I have so many different types of privilege that it would be hard for me to sort out which one I'm experiencing at any given moment, but this sort of like, this talk about not having to think, to not have to consider things. That's the ultimate white privilege, is that you can just look at societal problems. Like I could unplug from this right now. At any given time, I could take a look at this and be like, it's not my fight. And I could hunker down here on my property and go to work and do just enough work to not get fired and live a perfectly comfortable life. Like that's the height of white male middle class privilege. I think that if there is anything that I would distill down into white privilege, and this is going to be controversial, I just think Enlightenment philosophy of individualism is the ultimate in white privilege. The idea that you as an individual are the basic organizing unit of society, and what you need and what you want matters, rather than that you are part of a collective of people with shared concerns and needs and wants, and that you have to balance your individual needs and wants against the shared concerns, needs and wants. That's the height of white privilege, and that's the fundamental underpinning of the philosophy that generates the governing documents of this country, is just that Enlightenment principle of being a free individual rather than being a free person who is part of a community that you're supposed to serve, rather than being part, rather than being an individual who's looking out for themselves. And that's sort of like an abstraction, but that abstraction plays out in a place where the situation has been created through years of work from my ancestors to make Irish part of white, to immigrate from Scandinavia to this country. I could at any time unplug and just throw my hands up and say, forget this. And that's like, that's really the height of it to me.
I thought he saw a ghost. To me, white privilege partly is like, one of the most striking examples is I saw a white guy wrestling with a police officer, and he stole his baton and cracked him a couple of times with the police officer's own baton, and then he hopped into the car and drove away. And there's a video of it on the internet, and it's like,
Wow.
you see all these young black men who are just, they flinch wrong and pop, 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 pop. And then you see another video of a guy literally stole the policeman's police car after wrestling the baton out of his hand. And the other partner jumped on his back. And then I saw another video where the gentleman came out the house swinging an axe and still was apprehended. And so it's like, to me, that's the most striking examples of white privilege, because they can do so much. So they can make so many threatening movements and get the luxury of patience. The officer will be patient and work with them and try to talk them down, swinging an axe. It's like, wow. And you see unarmed black guys just get shot just if they flinch wrong. But then also I recognize, kind of like what the other gentleman was saying, I have my own levels of privilege. Like I grew up middle class, as a middle class African American, and so I never went hungry if I didn't have to. Like, hungry means I don't want to eat what was cooked, but there's definitely food in there. I never worried, gonna not be able to have a roof over my head. I had a comfortable middle class upbringing in that regard, but then there are, you know, other Black experiences that class doesn't matter. And then what the other gentleman said, like, yeah, there's white privilege, but there are poor white people who struggle too. And it goes back to, like, you know, the different social circles, intersectionality. You know, we're all very complex human beings in a big old complex quilt of America.
Well, and that's what I want to even kind of take that into. It seems like there's a consensus that white privilege exists, and because I grew up poor, right? My mom did a great job balancing resources, but we didn't have a lot of resources. So, but there are also poor people that I grew up around, poor white people, who also experienced some of the issues that I did, economically, socially. But I think that the privilege, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this one, is the threat that your identity is, like, it inherently poses, right? When Aaron talks about just the slightest flinch, right? And JP talks about, well, the appearance makes you feel scary. Well, you're from this particular neighborhood. And I remember coming down to college, and it was kind of a cool thing to be the poor Black guy that had the do-rag and the big clothes and all that stuff, because, you know, white folks, you know, this was the closest to Compton that folks are going to get, right? So, hey, now I have Compton in my backyard. I can see him, I can feel him, I can touch him, right? And then I can go about my business. Just very interesting that ends up almost being a way to say, yeah, you're poor, you know, but your identity is in and of itself has not been considered a threat. Is that the way that you would define white privilege to somebody who is, like, I mean, how do you convince somebody who is absolutely poor, on food stamps, don't know when their next meal is going to come from, don't know where their kids are going to go to school, their kids go to horrible schools, and then they hear Aaron, the Black man, say, hey, yeah, I grew up middle class, things are all good, you know, didn't worry about where my meal's coming from. How do you convince them that that person's more privileged than Aaron?
I don't know that you need to. Like, I think the point of intersectionality is to acknowledge that everyone is privileged in different ways, and the more of those things you stack together, the more privileged you are. So I wouldn't say more or less in terms of privilege. I would say different. You know, so for poor white folks that I know, I'll be honest, their white privilege isn't doing them much. It's doing something. I'm not going to say it's not doing anything. But if you are going to get evicted from your house because you got a tooth abscess and you had to go in to get your tooth pulled, but you had to call out of work to do that, so you got fired, so now you're going to get evicted from your house. Being poor is being put upon in a way that is maybe different than being put upon for being Black. I don't know that you can measure it and say that one is worse than the other. Both of those to me seem like grave threats to your safety. I think maybe the difference is like, for poor white people, if they escaped poverty, that threat wouldn't come with them. So I think it's more about consistency than it is about a particular numeral that you could, like, let's say we're on a Likert scale. I don't know that I could say that poor whites are at a 5 and Black folks everywhere at a 7. Like, I just don't think that Barack Obama is experiencing oppression in the same way that, or Colin Powell, or any rich person of color is experiencing the world as a threat in the way that a white person trapped in a cycle of poverty is experiencing that threat. But an equally poor black person is experiencing that threat of poverty in addition to the threat of blackness. So on a one-to-one, the black person is at 2 disadvantages instead of 1 disadvantage.
Well, because then if you compare Barack Obama to previous presidents, they've had their
Oh yeah,
in the White House. Barack Obama hasn't, and he's had a somebody who come after him to literally try and undo all of his policy and jam really his legacy in ways that we haven't seen prior.
absolutely.
So, equally, I see it.
Oh yeah, no, he absolutely has a disadvantage, and there is definitely a sort of, I don't know what you call the opposite of privilege other than the absence of privilege, but there is definitely an absence of respect for Obama that other presidents receive. I just think it's going to be really hard, based on what I know about poor white people, to get them to care about rich people at all. Like, I think when you're saying, hey, look at how Obama is being disrespected, my experience of poor whites is they're going to be like, what the fuck do I, pardon my language, what do I care about anything a rich person does, anything a powerful person does?
I kind of analyze the situation similarly to you, but I pretty much enumerate the privileges. So I would look at someone like you. Angela Davis has, Race, Gender, Class as her book. So I would look at someone like you and say you have, you're white and you're male. I don't know your income bracket or anything like that, but it's not, are you rich? It's just, are you not poor? So I would include middle class as a privilege too. So
absolutely.
I would look at someone like you. I would just assume you're middle class, white male, you're triple privileged. But I would even look at myself and say, I'm a male, so I have my male privilege. And I would look at Julianne and say that she is white, so she has her white privilege, but she's a woman, so she's, disadvantaged in a lot of parts of society on that part. And so some people have triple privilege, some people have double privilege. And then you look at someone like a black woman, and I'm like, you deserve a Statue of Liberty because you're not white or male. So a poor black woman is like, for Oprah Winfrey to be who she is, she should get her own statue somewhere, because how did she overcome all that? She was a poor black woman and now she's a billionaire.
So let's
I enumerate privileges. That's all I was saying. But part of that means you have to recognize your own privilege. So as a black man, I would say like conditioned, like, oh, Black Lives Matter and black people are oppressed, without recognizing that, some people do have it worse than me, and my blackness is at the forefront, but my male privilege, I don't ever complain about that. So it's like recognizing that I do have male privilege.
So I want to actually just ask about the framing. When we talk about privilege, right? When I hear privilege, it makes it sound like when you say a poor minority woman is without class, race, gender privilege, right? So that's the bottom of the social privilege ladder, so to speak, right? Is that normal, or is our normal the white male experience, right? Is our standard of human existence what JP is living, or is it what minority poor women are living, and that way you're getting privileges stacked on top of it? Or are we at a point of understanding JP to be considered privilege as opposed to normal, and so that now you're starting to take privilege away from people, right? So it's not privilege, it's oppression, right? You're adding oppression on. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I think that that's absolutely right. I feel very passionately about this. I should be the default. Like, everyone should get to live the way that I live. Period. There should be no one who has less than me. It's unconscionable, the things that we do to poor people and women and black and brown people and gay people, the fact that they have to fight to have what you call for me a privilege, this should be the default. Everyone should get this.
So then what impact does that reframing have on our conversation? Like if we're having this conversation, not necessarily from, okay, you know, Julianne is privileged, right? So now she's having this conversation from a privileged conversation as opposed to less oppressed, right? Or if a white male doesn't have the class, they are less oppressed. What impact would that reframing have on building commonalities between people based on that oppression rather than privilege or lack thereof? Am I making sense?
I think the best illustration of that is the I hope you guys have seen it. It was the Tom Hanks was on Saturday Night Live. He did a Jeopardy skit. It was Black Jeopardy, and he was the Donald Trump supporter. And it started off as a joke, but by the end of the skit, the point of the skit really illustrated that there were commonalities. So hopefully you guys have all seen it. But again, it's a Saturday Night Live, it's a Black Jeopardy skit with Tom Hanks, and Tom Hanks is playing a Trump supporter, and it's a hilarious way of demonstrating there is commonality amongst us all. But it's hard to talk about it if the people I'm talking to haven't seen the skit. But everyone, please check it out.
I've seen it. It's great.
I think the question of what is the default is an important one. And I think that's in flux, especially right now with the changing, you know, the way that the media landscape has changed. People, it's not like, you know, you turn, in the old days when you just turn on the TV and that was what was accepted as like basically mainstream and common. People are choosing their own media. They're watching Netflix, they're watching Hulu, they're subscribing to their services. And the representations are much more diverse. So it's not like, you know, when the Cosby's was the only Black show, you know, on TV. You see more diversity and representation, but I think in a lot other ways, the default or what we kind of tend to consider normal or normalized is the kind of white male American Christian hetero experience. Because that's still what is in power in the institutions in our society. And I think that speaks much more to class than, because, you know, you could have there's a book right up here about caging our own or something like that about, you know, you could have Black cops and prosecutors and judges, and they're still reinforcing mass incarceration among, you know, amongst Black people. So, you know, what is the institution that they're a part of, that they're integrating or upholding, and that I think tends to be more of a function of class. But like when I talk to poor white folks who are, you know, in the eviction type situation that John Patrick was mentioning, or there, you know, I feel like sometimes you see that resentment, like, oh, like now since affirmative action or whatever, like I can't, I'm not. I'm at a disadvantage because I'm white, or you know, that kind of thing.
Birth racism.
Yeah, you see that, and you see people having those kind of attitudes, and it's really tough to break through those. I mean, that's the kind of attitudes that Trump wrote a candidacy to the presidency on. You know, that's been built up over years of reaction against the civil rights movement, really. But I think, to me, I feel like those folks are more outliers. I mean, you got your Proud Boys and whatnot, but you see that more in the older generation. I think the newer generation is much more with it, and you can connect to them. You can talk to them about their class oppression without having to either completely ignore race, which is maybe something I would have done like 10 years ago. Don't even bring it up, or you know, acknowledge it and bring it up and say, this is, you've got it bad and somebody else has it bad, but maybe for a different reason, or worse in some ways or better in other ways. But yeah, I don't know. I think that's just It's more about the relationship really than it is about where that person stands in terms of where they are on the scale of oppression and privilege. It's more about like how can you build a relationship with that person and use that as a way to push them beyond where they're at right now.
Part of the reason why I wanted you guys to define your communities in light of what's going on now is because I also wanted to see if there were any issues beyond race that you think are pertinent in this particular movement. I see COVID, class issues interwoven here. Quite honestly, I see much of the movement all being about the same thing, right? But it appears that because Black Lives Matter is the prevailing narrative of the current movement, that is now shifted from, I mean, literally just a couple of weeks ago, this was all a class-based movement. Now it's just a race-based movement, so that the people who were previously storming the streets and the governor's offices are now at home, right? Because this is a race-based thing now, right? Do you see those the movements as being linked? Maybe I'm wrong on this. Do you see those movements as being linked? And if so, what are some strategies that might be implemented to bring those two movements together for some real sustainable change? And we got about 15 minutes left, so answer this question. Any other last thoughts you might have had on all of this? You know, just feel free to just wrap it all up.
I see the common link between both as anti-establishment. I don't know how to bridge them.
Say
but-
more. Say more. Say more.
I mean, it's actually been talked about as like a similar thread between Trump supporters and Bernie supporters, is that they are both groups of anti-establishment, you know, people, just different values, but it's definitely anti-establishment. So, I mean, I don't know. I cannot bridge it. I don't have the solution to that, but that's the common thread I see about the people who were storming the state capitals, you know, 3 weeks ago, and the people fed up with the oppression and in the streets now. They're all out anti-establishment.
I think that's about like all you can say about the similarities there. I would be surprised to discover that most of the Open It Back Up protesters were impoverished white folks. I suspect that most of the Open It Up protesters were middle class, upper middle class, business owning white folks, based on the signs that they held. They held signs that said things like, I want a haircut, I want to get my nails done, I want to go back to the bar. There were a few that said, let us go back to work, but from most of my working class friends, what I saw them demonstrating for or requesting was the ability to not expose themselves to a disease in order to have a livelihood. So I think that the people who were, I know that this is about building community and bridging divides, but I would be reticent to work with anyone who had participated in the Open It Up movement, because I just don't think that they share my concerns in terms of poverty, in terms of oppression. I think that I don't trust them.
But I mean, how many people being where you are share your concerns for and oppression?
That's hard to say. I think probably not enough.
And what I'm cutting to the chase here to say, how is it that, how do we know that I don't share their same concerns with poverty and oppression more than you and I share concerns of poverty and oppression? And
Well, I've known you for like 20 years.
I've invited Temla on for our last word session because she has had some great things to say in the chat, and I wanted to make sure that we elevated her voice. So she is going to actually have our last words. Okay, so we're gonna let everybody make their summary, and then we're gonna end on you, Tamala.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah. Well, no, we're gonna end on you. So I'm gonna let you, because you had some stuff in here about redlining that I want you to talk about, the redistricting, the voter suppression. So I just get in. I want you to summarize all of your last thoughts as folks are finishing up their statement.
You know, I just was speaking to, for those people who it's difficult to understand their privileges. And I just was mentioning that maybe part of the reason is just not really having a thorough understanding of the plight, the experiences of Black people, you know, not understanding that even though slavery ended, you know, with the Emancipation Proclamation, that, you know, we still went through Jim Crow, you know, we still went through civil rights, you know, still going through pregnancy versus education, you know, the Board of Education and all of that, still going through the equal employment. You know, there are so many things that so many laws had to happen, civil laws, just so we could be what the Declaration said. You know, everyone is equal, but we wasn't equal. And so I think it is also hard for people to understand that the government, you know, set this up, that it wasn't just wild stories, you know, that it was systematic, you know, the redistricting of voting districts, you know, and so because certain voting districts of certain geographical areas, purposely redistricting them for a specific candidate. Even Black people, when it comes to medicine, going to the doctors, being experimented on, you know, with the Tuskegee Syphilis Project, Henrietta Lacks. There's so much history that so many Americans are not aware of concerning the plight of African Americans. So that's why I think it's difficult for people to really understand their privilege, because they don't really understand how hard America tried to keep just basic civil rights from us. And so I'm just saying, I think that's part of the struggle. So I think learning, having an education about the plight of Black people could help loosen up some of that. And so I think that's important to learn, because you're not going to be able to understand it just by somebody telling you, because you would think, but why would the hospital take Black women's babies and tell them that their babies died at birth? Nobody would do that. But no, that happened to so many Black women. I think it was Detroit, but it was all over really, that these women were having babies and the hospitals were taking their babies and telling the mothers that their babies died. There's so much.
And the syphilis thing that blew my mind. I mean, I just went through again and updated my IRB training, and
Yeah.
that was a real thing where they literally have folks lined up thinking that they were getting a flu shot, and were actually injecting them with syphilis.
Yes. And then, so because that happened,
and then they wonder why I don't want a flu shot.
and not only wonder why you don't want a flu shot.
Now it's coronavirus shot.
Exactly.
Wonder why you don't go to the doctor at all. I still have family members that are totally against going to the doctor, you know? So I think if people could educate themselves more, and I know as much as I can, I'm going to be posting things in Operation Ally, you know, just for education purposes. But I think once you have a better understanding of how America treated Blacks, you don't learn it, in school. But I think that may help, I hope, So I think that education piece is really needed. And that's it.
Thank you.
Well, I definitely agree with you, Ms. Tamala. I think education is a huge piece. I think the awareness is a huge piece, but I would go a little bit further. I don't think that the country, the society was built just to limit the rights of African Americans, but this country is really rooted in a genocidal fantasy. It was you see it repeated over and over and over again, that there's this kind of social mentality of, okay, well, there's no slavery anymore, well then let's get rid of them. This and even Lincoln trying to say, like, send people back to Africa and stuff like that. But that's why the demand is for Black Lives to Matter, because it hasn't mattered to the people that have built these institutions and this country. And I just want to add too about we're talking about privilege, and I think that's one useful way to look at things. People are on a scale of having some level of privilege, being some level of oppressed, in terms of their different identities that they wear. But I also think that in a lot of ways, the discourse around white privilege has really supplanted, or has kind of taken the place. Is much more comfortable to talk about that than to talk about what really exists, which is white supremacy, and the fact that we live in a white supremacist country and world, really, because of the way that Europe colonized the rest of the world. I
have a video that I'm going to post in Operation Ally. I just was watching a video of a man who is African American. He's a multimillionaire, and he's just talking about his experience as an African American in corporate America. What he had to deal with. So I'm going to post it in Operation Ally.
Were you done, Ben?
I think so. That was pretty much my main points I wanted to bring up in terms of, kind of wrapping up.
Yeah, reshaping from white privilege to white supremacy. That's actually very interesting.
Yeah.
Julianne, Aaron, we still want your final words, but quite honestly, Ben, I also after we go to them, I want to come back. I want to know the difference functionally that you have and that you see that playing in the psyche of white Americans.
I just think that white privilege is something it's easier for people to confront. Easier for white folks to confront. They can read Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, and they see, oh yeah, when I walk into Thrifties, they're not looking at me thinking I'm gonna put something in my pocket, or if they do, they're not looking at me that way because of my color, and they can see that example. But it's a lot harder to confront the reality that this whole society is a settler state. And the genocide was not just an unfortunate, error or mistake or overreach, that it was a fundamental part of the plan, and that, those kind of truths are much more difficult, I think, for white folks, especially to confront, because it means that we have to take responsibility. It means we have to take responsibility for historical actions of our ancestors and for what goes on right now. And right now, that might just mean being in the streets and defunding the police and supporting those campaigns. But what does it mean historically? It means we have to give this land back to the original owners, or at the very least, redistribute the land and the resources in a way that is much more equitable. And that hurts my pocketbook as a white person. And that's the conversation that most of our folks aren't willing to have.
If I can piggyback off of that, I think that a big part of that is that it forces us to have a complete reckoning with everything we've been taught and believed our entire lives. So it required all these people with privilege to voluntarily decide to really explore everything that they've been told, to find out a lot of which is completely untrue, and say that the history that we learned is not history the way that it happened, instead of people trying to do revisionist history, which is what I was taught in my conservative religion, where people tried to change, point out other lenses by which things occurred. And when you talk about the individualism and the enlightenment and the privilege we have to really, be the captain of our souls and focus on, very individual goals, and we're not very collective, right? Fundamentally from the beginning, it was always designed to just benefit a few white landowners, and that's trickled down. And so people who look like me and were raised like I was, it's like you have to have a real midlife crisis, like not one about what car you drive or your virility as a sexual being, but like a real, like, come to Jesus, you've been taught a bunch of shit. Sorry, Thomas. And you have to do that voluntarily. So I think ultimately education is a huge piece, but also relationship and conversation, so that we can learn to be collective and want for the good of the group, the good of the entire nation, instead of our little piece that's just bebopping along okay as long as we stay in denial. It's very challenging, but obviously really important and necessary.
I agree with you, Julianne. Yeah.
I need to call you.
Aaron, sir.
Sure.
Don't call me sir. So I want to piggyback on everything I've heard so far. I am a true believer that ethnic studies is a key component. Assembly member Jose Medina over in Riverside has a bill called AB 321, which makes ethnic studies a requirement to get your high school diploma.
Wait, AB what?
331.
331. Okay.
Yeah. And there was also another bill, but it failed. It was for to make ethnic studies a graduation requirement for the whole Cal State system. But I think at the high school level, that should be mandatory. You can't graduate high school unless you took ethnic studies. And then ethnic studies is the vehicle to facilitate these history lessons and these tough conversations that need to happen amongst the plethora of Americans from different backgrounds. Like you said, with the syphilis experiment, one of the other tragedies in American history was the father gynecology. I don't know if you heard about him, but the whole medical practice of gynecology, the guy who's credited with being the father of that, he did all his experiments on slave women. So there's so much scientific knowledge that we have that the backbone to that were Black bodies. Henrietta Lacks. But I bring up the gynecology one because you got to imagine what type of tools and anesthesiology that these horrible women had to go through for his scientific experiments in the 1800s. They don't have, I don't want to imagine, but it's like the truth has to come out about this type of knowledge.
Right.
And so ethnic studies is one of my key advocacy points. And that's for the new generation growing up. They grow up with a deeper understanding outside of the whitewashed American history class that we all take. But then for the current people who are older than high school age, it's going to require community conversations like Thomas is facilitating right now. So I just say ethnic studies is for the new crop that's still in school age range. But I love these type of conversations. I think they're necessary. I love hearing multiple points of view. And that's all. Go learn, watch a lot of stuff on Netflix. I actually logged on to Netflix today, and my home screen had a Black Lives Matter section up front. I had to from
Oh,
logging on, I had to click like another button to get rid of the pre-selected Black Lives Matter selection. You know, I was like, oh shoot, I hope they don't know I'm a black man and they did that just because they know I'm a black man. Oh, let me make it. Or is that for every single Netflix account? You gotta press
I
the
don't
button
know.
to get out of the black.
I got it too, man.
JP, what does your Netflix do?
It's Black Lives Matter.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Amazon Prime too, like have a whole row. Like please, like this is we're doing this solidarity series so that we can cross paths and understand like how every community has a role in what it is that we're doing. Black Lives Matter is the flag that we're flying under it, but this is a human rights movement. Everybody's involved. So jump on those streaming platforms, take advantage of the free networks. We have a few more solidarity programs coming up. We're going to be looking to bridge the generational gap, right? So what are young Black folks thinking? Millennials, Xers, and boomers. What are these folks thinking? We're going to be talking to the police, talking to our Asian community, you know, both the Middle Eastern as well as you know, the other parts of Asia. So the point is just like to literally get everybody involved in the conversation and figure out what we all have at stake and make sure we all get on the same page.
And hopefully the end result is empathy and understanding. That's all that I hope is the consequence of it. You watch it, you educate, and in your heart you have understanding and empathy. That's all that you can ask for.
Well, and actually what I would ask is that if you open it, you open your heart to it and you take it not with the expectation of fighting against it or what your argument is going to be against it, but also what are the truths? And if there are some things that you think are biased or you think are untrue, then send us messages. Aaron is a very intelligent guy. I am volunteering him now to respond to all of your issues. Okay, but like send in those questions, send in those comments and those concerns, and let's work through the information so that we all get it. That's a great point.
I think now, absolutely, Thomas, now is the time for people who have questions to go ahead and get it out, because this is the best platform to get an honest response.
And we have an Operation Ally group that I'd also like to invite you to join. Again, you can come join, and we are there answering those questions. We're here to have tough conversations in an environment of love. I love everybody. I'm not going to keep saying it, but actually I am going to keep saying it because I need you to know it. From the bottom of my heart, I love you all. That being said, thank you guys for participating. Thank you guys for joining us on Facebook. You guys all have a good evening.
Thank you,
Thomas.
Okay, bye-bye.